Welcome to Far Realms Radio. I'm Skylar.
And I'm Justin,
This is our podcast of many things.
where we give you eldritch advice to improve your Dungeons & Dragons games.
Let's dive in.
So welcome to Far Realms Radio. Today we are talking about running your first game as a DM.
Episode 8 is tips that we can give you, advice that might have for you, things that we've seen that will hopefully empower you to run your first game and then run your second game and then run your third game and then run your 50th game.
Yeah, we're learning to be better DMs all the time, so join us on this journey.
So tell me about the first time that comes to your mind when you ran the first game you ever ran. How did it go?
God.
Like, what was it like? How old were you when you did it?
The first game I ever ran, I think I was 11.
Wow. Oh, you were young when you ran the first
I
one.
had started playing when I was 10. We had books when I was 8, but I had no idea it was a game until about the time I was 10.
Huh.
Just flipping through AD&D monster manuals and then going out in the backyard and...
Did your dad buy the books? Or
No, my friend's sister had it, of course, right? It's always your friend's sibling who's older and
your
cool.
Your friend's sister. What a cool... She was like the 80s, I guess.
Right?
Cool
Yeah.
girl.
Yeah,
Nice.
she was apparently cool. And we were essentially using it for kid LARP fuel. You know, you look at the monsters and then you go out in the backyard and fight them with your plastic sword.
Right, play pretend.
Yeah, of course. So I was the one who forced my neighborhood friends to play this game. I quickly realized if I didn't run it, there would be no game to play. So I bought the books and I got my buddies into the dining room and we played a very kick in the door style type of play, featuring a lot of dungeons and random arena battles simply for the sake of battling.
Probably it was like a map or something.
Of course, yeah, right, exactly. We had like one map.
This is the arena map.
We had one of the the play mats that you would draw on and erase, of course.
Right.
There's a lot of really stupid PvP between my only 2 party members who are constantly trying to kill each other. It was a great time. Honestly, I think my lack of knowledge and experience forced me to keep things simple, and I think that's part of what didn't turn us off to the game right away.
Yeah. Yeah, I think of my first experience running a game was also, I was very young. I was 13. And I think it was basically me and a few buddies were sitting around in one of our basements, and they were a little older than me. They were 15. And they had run the prior module, one of them. He's the guy who had the Dungeon Master's Guide. And of the 3 or 4 of us, depending upon which night it was, he thought that despite me being the youngest and newest to the group, that I was the best to run the next whatever. And I thought that this was just him trying to get me to take over the game so that he could play the game. But I was new to the group, so okay, sure, fine, So I went and bought an adventure. It was a 2nd edition adventure, and it was, it was actually pretty accessible, I guess, for a new DM. It was not the first adventure I would ever throw at anybody to run, but then again, I don't know what would be. It definitely colored my thinking about the game henceforth forever. It was The Gates of Firestorm Peak by Bruce Cordell in 2nd edition. And it was like designed for 5th level characters minimum, 5th to 7th level characters. And the only reason I think that I picked that one because that was the one that was available. It happened to be close enough to our characters. We were 4th level at the time. I was like, oh, we can make it work. We got to figure out how we're going to get a level sometime between now and then. And I ran it, and it did a good enough job to explaining how things worked, I guess, and how you could run it. It definitely didn't prepare me for the kinds of things that players can do sometimes.
I don't think anything can prepare you for that. That's part of the game.
Yeah, it's one of the core parts of it. But so both of us, we were both very young when we encountered the game, and started running a game very early. But a lot of people in our lives now are new to the game and are adults, and I think that arguably that while the target market of teenagers has certainly not shrunk any in the time since the 80s when you and I got involved in this, it's only increased to adults, right? Which is a massive, huge market.
I mean, there's an explosion in the amount of players, and the thing to remember is most people who play D&D are players, not DMs. DMs are a smaller portion of it, but getting more people to DM is really the biggest tradition. I think that it's important to push forward with, because we have so many people now who come to the game from older. They've seen it on streaming and things like that, and running a game can be this kind of scary thing, especially, you hear people talk about the Matt Mercer effect and all this nonsense. There's always been really good DMs out there that make you nervous to run your own game.
Yeah.
Like, anytime you go and you saw that when you were younger, it doesn't have to be someone on streaming. Like, you'll see someone run a game and your jaw will drop and you're like, I don't know if I can do anything like that.
Wow, that person looks really good. How did they learn to do those things?
Right? And it's hard to learn. There's so much to DMing that you never get told.
And there are many, many different ways of DMing too, right? There are a bajillion different styles depending upon people and the style of game and the group who shows up, so...
I mean, half of it depends on that social layer, really, right?
Right. Well, so what do you think for somebody today, maybe if they're like wondering, do I want to try to DM or I don't know, it's kind of intimidating, and we'll talk about like the structures of it, but what are some of the things maybe that would make them leap over that choice to be like, yeah, I do want to run my first session. I want to try the DM bit. I want to,
I know the first thing is if you're not running it, there's no game. That's what got me DMing.
That's true. That's what's kept me DMing over so many years too.
I mean, at first, I was one of those forever DMs, and I was like, I want a character. Why won't someone else run this? And so I really was always excited when I could play at my friend's house,
but
and he would.
The game wasn't going to happen if you weren't the
exactly.
DM.
And if I was playing neighborhood game, with my brother and my friends, like if I didn't run it, there was no game, and that meant playing like once a month, which was not sufficient.
So this might look like an email thread today, I guess, which is how we coordinate our games. I imagine a lot of people do out there, and it's like, oh, we're going to try and get together. Oh, so and so can't make it. Well, there's still like 4 of us, even though we're down 2. Well, why don't we get together and we'll figure something out? And then people show up, and somebody's like, well, I'll run a game. Why not?
Right. I think part of it really comes down to, first of all, the people that you're playing with. If you're running your first game, try to play with people that you either know or you've played games with before. That will take out so much of that social pressure and make you more comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, this might be anything ranging from like coworkers that you want a team activity with to like your buddies on a Saturday afternoon, which is what was when I was a teenager, right?
Right, and there's enough social pressure within the game without adding more onto the real like meat space layer
with
on
strangers.
top.
It's hard with strangers.
You have to be vulnerable usually to role play really well, or
it's
just
more strict social rules.
There's an exchange there.
Yeah.
So I think looking for a place that you're familiar with, whether it's your local game store or your friend's house, and people that you're comfortable with is a big, big thing, especially, if you're going to touch on more sensitive topics or you're dealing with people different than yourself. You need to be kind of sensitive to that as well.
Yeah, I think like I often say this, right? Like it's about the table. So much of the game matters depending on who shows up at the table, and that as the DM, part of that is your responsibility to help, I think, pick that. So that's actually, in my mind, a powerful responsibility and a good one to have, especially at your first time, because you get to decide what game you want to run. Like if you're I want to run it, well, obviously make it comfortable for yourself. Pick some people that you
pick something that you want to run,
right? And with common interest that people, they understand, they can hook into it, and people that you enjoy their company because you're going to be hanging out with them for hours at a time.
You're playing a game too, so your fun matters. And I think
I wouldn't recommend doing it with total strangers.
No, I would not run my first game with total strangers if I could avoid it. You could do it. It's so much easier when it's people that you know, because you can essentially skip a step, and there's a little bit more inherent trust built already, which is really helpful.
Yeah, like common communication,
especially when you're nervous and you're doing something new. DMing is really scary for the first time. It's thankfully I had a large break before I came back to the hobby, and
it's scary for every time.
I always have the anxiety, but it was kind of nice. The one nice thing about being away for the hobby for many years and not running a game is when I came back, I was like, oh yeah, this is pretty tough. I used to be pretty used to this, and I didn't have this level of anxiety. And so I had to kind of build that back up a little bit, especially since I was new to 5th edition. I was thinking in a 3.5 mindset for a long time. So,
I mean, yeah, and I think it does take attention, right?
Yeah, totally. And one of the best things about running a game with people that you know is it's going to be easier to just talk to them about this and straight up level with them and be like, hey, I really want to try running a game so I can become a good GM and run some awesome adventures for us, but I've never done it before. I'm going to make a couple mistakes. Are you cool just like hanging through that with me so I can become better at this thing I want to do?
Right. Or even helping me out, like the playing of the game is a collaborative exercise, which is why the people matter so much. And that means that it's not also the DM, especially a first-timer's responsibility to have all of the rules down,
No.
Because the thing is, when you run, in my opinion, your very first game, the experience that you have running your very first game is not dissimilar from the experience you get from running or playing a new game, a different both group or especially group and system, if you play other RPGs. So it's a useful exercise to think about and go through. Do a little prep for.
Exactly. And the thing that is nice is as long as your players aren't like total assholes, telling them these things like will actually take pressure off of you when they inevitably happen, because you're gonna make mistakes in your first session. And if your players kind of know and can help watch out for that, especially the more experienced ones, they can kind of have your back and kind of help you out, whether you forget a rule or you need someone to look up a spell.
Delegate absolutely.
Exactly. Maybe someone helps running initiative for you. I love having people do that in games so I can focus on other things. And so if you have those experienced players, like if they're players worth having in your group, they're going to help you out and kind of like every true DM wants to see other people step behind the table and start DMing. It's part of our tradition in the game.
The more ownership everybody has over the game, the better time everybody has.
Plus that means you get to have a character and you don't have to DM. Sometimes that's nice.
Right.
We do a game. We both run games that we both also play in. So neither of us is stuck in the forever DM track.
Right.
And it's not, I honestly prefer DMing now more than having a character, but it's such a good reminder to be a PC and see things from the other perspective, because you're like, oh man, yeah. Oh yeah, I don't like that. I need to work on that in my own game.
It really reminds me how different of a game they are.
It's like two different experiences.
Right.
I think it's really helpful to do both.
You play as the player, yes, definitely, and you get to see like how the collaborative problem solving works and how you exchange spotlight, really is what it boils down to. And time and resource. And then there's the DM, of course, you're the one who gets to make it work for everybody. So you also get to point the spotlight at various places, but that means that you very seldom own it yourself. So I think part of it is like you have to know not being a DM is not for everybody, but you're listening to this podcast probably because in some part of your mind is, well, what if I decide, what would it take? Maybe I want to.
Come to the other side of the table.
It's not the dark side. It's the prismatic side.
So the other thing I think that's important to kind of think about when you're running your first game is to take care of those real life logistics that kind of might throw a wrench into your plan and add extra stress or chaos. So things like having enough pencils or dice or a battle map or ordering food and kind of figuring out how you're going to do that, because you're going to need all of your focus for this first game. It's going to be overwhelming, even with all of your focus and even with prep.
There's the real key part of making any of the sessions, including the first one, maybe especially the first one, work is the flow of the game, right? So a lot of these normal things that you have to tackle every single time, food is a really big one, and it's very disruptive. What does everybody want? Can you all agree on what kind of pizza? You'd think the answer would be easy, but no, never. It's never. That's like a classically, archetypally hard choice.
It is easier than scheduling the game and getting people to show up.
Right.
I mean, maybe free pizza will also help that.
I mean, I think making it regular is an easy thing to do. If you choose, like, here's your regular cadence, and then you can do the same thing with food and also all the materials, right? You move those things out of the way, you help make them just be handled logistics-wise, then the game can really focus, the players can really focus on the game itself, right? They don't have to think about all this other stuff and get their all feathers ruffled and then settle back down again and get back in the game.
Exactly. It really does kind of break up the action there. So once you kind of look at those kind of that social layer, those real-world logistics, get those out of the way. Make sure you're feeling comfortable with that so you're not feeling out of your element. And you're looking at the game itself. In a broad sense, I think keeping it simple and not trying to get too fancy on your first outing as a DM is really important.
Yeah, I mean, you broke this down quite well, and I'm a big fan of not fancy. This is a thing I mentioned before that I think adhere to. There's some improv advice, and it applied specifically to role players. It's, do the obvious thing. 9 times out of 10, it will be obvious. And the 10th time, it'll be brilliant, because that's just how it works. What's obvious to you is not obvious to other people, and they'll find it really interesting. So, really not going whole kit and caboodle, maybe even buying an adventure off the shelf,
I mean, yeah, we'll get to the more specifics after talking about these kind of ideas in a broad term, for sure. I'm definitely on board with that. But the thing to think about is it's your first time doing something. You're probably not going to be amazing off it right at the bat, especially because GMing is a mix of different skill sets. You might find that there's certain parts that you're like, oh, wow, I'm actually pretty good at this part, or I'm good at that. But then you will also find, wow, I'm really struggling with this. I don't have a lot of experience here, or this is difficult. Like for me, like maps and connecting plot threads and building a living, breathing world, easy, no problem. I can do that, no problem. For me, the harder part is taking an NPC and turning them into a person and like getting the accent in there or giving that little bit of quip to them that kind of brings them alive. I struggle a little bit more with like, okay, who the hell is this guy? How can I communicate that to my players through role play?
Right. I mean, and this is why we said earlier that there are the different styles everybody has, right? So I guess one of the things about being the DM is to know yourself a little bit, what you look for, what you like and what you think you're good at, and lean into those, follow your gut, right? So by the inverse, and this is why I think it's a nice balance being in each other's games, those are the areas that I'm strong, like, oh yeah, sliding into a character.
Oh yeah.
And understanding how they sound and how they think. And
I've watched you go back and forth between 6 characters with different accents, and amazing.
This is the benefit of a bard degree.
And usually that's like one of the, hey, don't do this. And I'm like, no, let him do it. It's great.
Yeah, it works. But I think that by the same token, the plotting out all of the detailed machinations of a simulation, which I've had DMs do that really well in the past, that's not an area of my expertise, right? It focuses on what the narrative needs to be in that next moment. So, if you're going to try it, you have to know some sense of what kind of game you're going to run. And I think part of like that knowing yourself is because from a high level, you are selling other players on playing your game. It's like you have a board game. You're like, hey, do you want to play Eldritch Horror with me?
There's some buy-in you have to get from them.
Here's what the game looks like. I'm like, I don't know. It's a lot of pieces. I don't know. How long does it take? Oh, it takes 4 hours. Well, I do like long board games. So I don't know, like you have to. So in this case, I like to think of it like a board game or a card game. You're the pitcher. You're like having to, you got to get buy-in.
Yeah, to use a sports analogy, you should probably like learn to dribble before you start like trying to dunk and shoot 3-pointers and do crazy fake outs.
Don't hate us for using a sports analogy, nerds. These two are not incompatible. We both want you to know that sports and nerdiness go hand in hand.
They're not mutually exclusive.
And I know sports ball is not popular for many of you, but it's okay. Don't hate us.
It's kind of like my analogy I like to use is...
It's a good analogy.
The other sports analogy I like to use is watching someone else GM or even being in a game with them. It's kind of like watching someone else play sports, right? Just because you've seen someone do it doesn't mean you have firsthand experience. And we've all watched sports with people who talk like, oh, they couldn't do that, I could do that. Like every time you watch the Olympics and there's someone on the gymnast rings, there's some guy saying, oh yeah, I could do that. I'm like, yeah, okay, sure, bud. I'll believe that when I see it. But you may think, oh, I've seen this. I know how this works. And then you get to the other side of the table and you're like, okay, I don't know how any of this works. This is a very different experience. So I think what's really important there for yourself to start to get a little more specific when I say keep it simple or learn to dribble before you start dunking is the boundaries and limitations on choice are going to make it easier for you. The problem here is you don't want your players to feel like you're restricting their freedoms too much. So you have to approach it and get their buy-in through the kind of the right angle. And in this case, what you're really offering them is this delayed gratification of, hey, I'm kind of a newbie right now, but in the future, I'm going to get really good and I can run these awesome games that have all the kind of the things that you want in them and really make them games that you're going to have fun with. But for now, I need to add these extra limitations so that I can build those skills and kind of really understand how to do that for you. That's kind of the payoff that they're accepting or the payoff that they're expecting in return for accepting all these like limitations that you're going to have to put on into this first game just so you can keep a handle on it and not let it get away from you.
Yeah, I mean, and I would say also to sort of add to that, know that every time you do this, just like every time you show up to play a sport or do a performance or any kind of anything, it's different every single time. And that's good both.
Yeah, every time.
The time it's bad because it'll be better a different time. It's not going to always be that. And also it's good. It's true the time it's good too, because it's not going to always be that good, but that does mean they're going to remember that, so like know that even every time you show up to do it, it's just not going to be, even if you nail it, like you walk out there the first time and you're like, boom, that was amazing. You come back the next time and be like, it was okay.
I feel like the first couple times you don't know, really. You're like, was that good? Was it terrible?
Yeah.
You guys, are you going to come back
It takes
next week?
a long time to get a sense for how feedback is at the table.
It's hard to say. Prepped isn't always directly related to how well you do. Like, I've had games where I prepped a ton and the session felt like shit.
Right.
And then I've had games where I really didn't have time and it was amazing just because that's the way the session went and the energy in the room or whatever. So when we're talking about boundaries and limitations, Skylar mentioned like a module that's already set and written, pre-gen characters. We'll talk about that more in those specifics.
Totally.
What those limitations and boundaries will be. But it's kind of the idea that there's freedom within the box, right? There's freedom within discipline. And it will kind of make the game easier for you by just simply knowing more of the possibilities of what could happen.
Yeah, I think that a good place to start for running your first game is to have kind of your headline, if this was a news story maybe, or like your event description, like one sentence, like you're on Netflix and it's your little blurb underneath the title, and it's like, party of adventurers dives into a dungeon and beats a dragon. Or is it dystopian science fiction thriller heroes save world headline? Like just whatever it is, something like that in your mind.
Sentence or two.
Right. An anchor.
Punches it.
That helps you understand what the game is you're playing tonight. Because the players will cue off of you. And good players, and there are many out there, will help feed that for you, but they're looking to you to have that cohesive sense of what the game is for everybody. And I think that it's helpful to just sort of think about that piece.
Definitely. The other thing that I think is really important is to go in with a realistic mindset. Like, don't expect to go in and be a pro on your first day. This is your first time doing something.
Right.
You can't expect to be good at something the first time you do it. That's usually not how things go. Like, most people will have one or two things in their life they can say, oh, yeah, I was really good at my first time on this. DMing's not going to work that way. It is a weird mix of specific skill sets. So just accept that you may suck a little bit. It's okay. Mm-hmm. The other people, especially if they've DM'd, they know that there may be parts that are a little sucky. Whatever. Just you got to expect that. You got to know that, hey, maybe some of the things I'm going to do are going to suck. And just accepting that, it's going to take some pressure off of you. It's going to make it a little bit easier to get into that. I'm not saying it won't still be stressful, because your first couple games will probably feel more stressful than they will fun, because you're learning new things, and that's how that tends to go. Like, as you stick with it, the ratio will often get better. I mean, I'm sure like the first time you rode motorcycles, there was a little more fear and stress in the fun there, and it shifted over time.
Yeah, I mean, as an avid motorcyclist, the very first time I rode a motorcycle, I was terrified. I thought I was going to die, and I thought that way for a long time. And then eventually it eased off, even on the very first riding. And that's just how you do something better and get better at it. It's just like any performance. Practice makes better, and you learn as you go. And you have to, I think, intrinsically. But also, I think that the DMG, while it has a lot of good advice, it does not teach you how to run a game. And the player's handbook isn't targeted at you. And the monster manual is full of imagination, and maybe the place I would start, aside from if I wasn't going to pick an adventure off the shelf. And I really do think that that's the way to go. But really, more that when you decide to run the game, wherever you decide to hook into it, be it, or we're going to go hunt this monster who's been rampaging through a town. There are a lot of rules, or you want to publish adventure, whatever. There are a lot of rules that you could know that the DMG does have that I want to explicitly discourage you from using for your first session. And I'm not going to tell you what rules not to use. What I'm going to tell you is know the rules that are interesting to you. And if you don't understand a rule, don't use it.
That's great advice.
Don't worry about it.
Honestly, I think trying to refer to the rule book as little as possible when you're kind of doing your first session is not a bad way to go. And we'll kind of talk about the specifics of that. But the thing to understand is that you can't really get better at GMing without GMing. There's no like secret GM playbook. Like, I've looked for it. Trust me. The Dungeon Master's Guide, despite the title, until recently, it would rarely give you much aside from tools for DMing without telling you what to do with said tools.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say there are a bajillion different disagreeing GM playbooks, and they usually are so specific to whatever that person was playing at that time,
or so generic,
as to not be so helpful, And we like to say that we have some help for GMs, and that's part of why we're doing this podcast. It's one of the big reasons, but also
so we can get better at GMing.
The important part of it is to remember that some part of this activity is critical thinking. You as the DM have to have that.
It's also because our significant others will not let us talk about Dungeons and Dragons all the time.
They get really tired of hearing us talk about it to the extent that we do.
So we scheduled time to drink beer and talk to you guys instead.
Hi.
The other thing about those tools that's kind of tricky, it's kind of a catch-22, is like you don't know the value of those tools and how to use them yet when you're flipping through the DMG. Like
right.
They're just random. They're truly random tables to you at that point.
Right.
Like you don't have a context for like, oh my God, I see why this would be so useful.
Or like, why is there a system for managing food foraging? I thought this was like dungeon delving, or this is, my friend talked to me about this, like a political intrigue game.
Right. You're like, there's a lot of rules in here, which I don't think I'll need.
Right. Overland travel. Does that really matter?
Right. And
how does that matter for the game?
Not in D&D, it doesn't.
Right.
But generally, like the thing is, you have to be kind of familiar with the system as a whole to really kind of understand the value of its individual pieces, right? Like if you don't know how a motorcycle works, how do you know how important one piece is compared to the other? I'm sure you can give me a good analogy here.
You have to see it in action, of course. But if you're thinking about running the game, I'm almost going to guarantee that you've been a player in the game before too. Maybe there's a rare amongst you who've seen it and went, "Wow, I really want to be the DM." But in which case
you're awesome.
Yeah, you're awesome. But I also want to encourage you to go play a game first. Like if you really want to be the DM, go play one first, and then try. But there's, and maybe I would say it that way because there's some part of this that's required is a little bit of, I don't even know, it's not quite hubris that I want to call it, but it is definitely something. Well, we'll talk more about this in a little bit.
Blissful arrogance.
Yeah, I mean, like confidence. It does require confidence. You're going to run the game. You're the referee, right? So you have to wear that hat. This
is true. Having a confidence or passion for the game really does make it a lot easier.
And being willing to be fair, right? The game is so fluid that the kind of role that this requires is somebody who can look at what is both very abstract in this imaginary world and also how to balance it for all of the other players so it doesn't clearly bias one or the other, especially when, like me, I have my spouse at the table as well. Like it would be really easy to see giving preferential treatment or working out relationship nits with your spouse at the D&D table, right? It just requires management. And that's true of all of your friends, of course,
Definitely. I mean, you have relationships with most people at the table probably if you know them. So the thing to remember is really that most of the beginner products you're going to look at, and we'll talk about starter sets and beginner's boxes because they are great tools for running your first game. But the thing to remember is most beginner products are focused on new players. They're usually not focused on new DMs because economically it makes way more sense to target new players than new DMs.
Yeah, I mean, players are the ones who'll be clamoring for...
They're the ones who buy the books.
All of the, who's going to run my game, what class am I going to be? They have all the expansions, they all have the modules they can get, or plugins, so to speak. It's like equipment. It's your gear, it's your feats, it's your spells, it's your customizable kit. I think actually... if you're curious about DMing and you're one of those who likes to read or explore, and I strongly encourage these behaviors in DMs, there's some part of me that sometimes says that this edition of D&D is not necessarily the best one for diving in as a new player, which is, I think, more why I feel strongly in this edition that starting with a published adventure is a stronger choice. Because in today's world, and this is not always true of prior versions of D&D and isn't true of other role-playing games in today's world. Today's world has a bunch of different really good, accessible RPGs that are D&D-like, cousins of D&D, similar, better layout, different whatever, that don't have the constraints of Wizards and Hasbro and a big marketing, all of this,
I think Dungeon World is a great example of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, Paizo, which has a bunch of expats from Wizards, has their own with Pathfinder, and now Pathfinder 2. We'll see how that is this year at Gen Con. But this is not me here telling you don't play Dungeons and Dragons as your first session. Definitely do, but it's maybe more me saying know the game, the type of game you're playing, and cross-reference.
Pick the right game and play it with the right people.
Know the difference between chess and checkers and why people who play chess hate checkers and why people who play checkers don't care. Like they're useful to inform each other, and then know the difference between Chinese checkers and why you will lose to me.
I probably would. I have to agree. Yeah, if you feel like another game is the place to start as a game master, yeah, don't be afraid to try that, and then kind of break that ice and move over to D&D from there. Because I will say, while 5e is probably one of the more accessible editions they've ever come out with,
the most accessible, I think,
the most. GMing has always been this like, all right, here's my notes, kid. Like, you can figure this out, right? All right, see ya.
Right.
Like, most of the adventure modules almost just read like someone else's campaign notes without much formatting or organization. I think it's important to keep in mind that you're fending for yourself most of the time as a DM.
And one of the things that I like to do very often is, both as a longtime DM, but also I think this is a really great idea for new players. Get whatever RPG accessories you can get your hands on, and steal from them and pull them into your D&D game.
Don't be afraid to steal ideas.
So if you're a nerd and you're into Warhammer 40K, let's say, and you happen to have a novel book that has like an interesting story that you enjoy, or maybe it's from the Warhammer 40K role-playing game and you found the plot interesting, but you don't have you don't have the friend group that's interested in 40K or the Warhammer 40K books you'd need, but you do have D&D or enough amongst your group you could play that. Run the game and steal the story. Take the content and use it for yourself, the structure whole hog, or a mechanic that you like in another game, that has to do with maybe superhero powers or whatever it looks like. D&D, especially this edition, it's very accessible, but that's also for homebrewing. That's also for hacking on the rules.
Very easy to
system.
design for. However, I would say probably don't do that in your first game. Let's talk about the specifics of that.
I mean, I think if that's what it takes to hook you into it,
I mean, if that's what it takes, yes,
go for it.
But you're biting off, more that you got to chew there with that.
But this is why I say I definitely push people strongly toward using published content, because the less work you have to do, the more fun you can focus on.
So let's talk about controlling your controllables. That's what I like to kind of call this. Like,
okay, great. Yeah,
creating this box for your first game, or these boundaries. I think the best piece of advice here is do not sit down and start a long-term campaign.
Oh, definitely don't.
Don't do that on your first time.
No. Maybe just rethink that until you have a really good, feeling about it.
I understand where you're coming from, because you're like, I'm going to make this the greatest campaign ever, and it's going to run for years, and all my friends will love it. You'll still do that later on. With every campaign you design, you'll have that little dream in your head. However, it's so much better to establish like a set limit of sessions through which you're going to run your first game.
Start with the end in sight.
It's going to take more than one session unless you're doing a one shot.
You know exactly where you're going to go. Like know where you want to end this.
Right, exactly. Make sure there's kind of a light at the end of the tunnel there. I think between 1 and 5 sessions is usually the place to go.
My bookmark is 3.
Yeah, 3 is kind of the sweet spot, I think, for sure, if you can get it done. Sometimes, you may have to, players do something ridiculous. It takes longer than you think. That will always happen.
Right.
You need to add an extra session in there to wrap it up, whatever.
Somebody was sick, or there was a break, or the fight took too long, or whatever.
But doing this is really good because, one, it's going to take the pressure off of you when you make those mistakes and things don't work out the way you wanted to. And then those mistakes will not come back to haunt you for an entire campaign, which you do not want. The other reason is your players are going to be so much more willing to put up with said mistakes if they know there's that light at the end of the tunnel. They're like, especially your experienced players, they may grumble, but they know, okay, I only have to deal with this for 2 more sessions, and then we can get into something different or better or whatever. I think the other thing that's nice about having a shorter, limited time is to remember that players always get through less content than you think you do. They may skip things that you've designed, and they may jump ahead in terms of what you had planned order-wise, but they will usually get through less content than you expect because they will spend time arguing or shopping.
There was of course, thanks. I knew that was going to come back to bite me. There was a rule of thumb that came about in 3.5. I think it might have been 3rd edition. It was in that time frame that talked about, it had both the progression, I think it was 3.5. It had both the progression of how characters advanced, how many experience points you need from level to level, and how many encounters that broke down to. Mm-hmm. And then that meant, okay, so I think in 3rd edition, it was like 4 encounters every level, and that meant that you could design your encounters a certain way, blah, 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 blah. The math you don't need to worry about for this purpose, but what shook out of that line of thinking was that for running a specific time slot game, like at a convention game or any other kind of game, then you'd have, let's say, one encounter every 45 minutes for your 4-hour game, and you would have 3.5 encounters, which the math, of course, doesn't quite add up because there's squishy time in between. So, planning, what I took away from that was like, all right, you get basically one encounter an hour for whatever your time slot is.
You'll find a different rate works for different groups.
Right. Depending upon also level of experience of the player. Like
Definitely.
if you have a group of experienced players that you are lucky enough to be running for your first time and they know how to chew through an encounter, you can get through a whole bunch.
You'll get through a little faster.
But also they may just spend the time just shooting the shit at the table and talking about all kinds of things that are not relevant to what's going on right now.
Of course.
And
comes with the territory.
Time just goes by. So I would say like have some idea of no more than one encounter per hour, right? You're not going to get done.
Yeah.
You're not going to get there.
Probably won't. And the nice thing is the shorter time frame of kind of these set limit of sessions will really kind of prevent you from overcomplicating the narrative, trying to get too creative with things, because you will have a lot of good ideas as you're going through, like, oh my God, what if I did this or that or this? Mm-hmm. And a lot of new DMs are kind of afraid to implement them right away or override something that's pre-made, and that's fine. Eventually, you'll get to the point where you don't care, and you will. But knowing you're like, I got to wrap this up in 2 sessions will kind of help you from trying to biting off more than you can chew, really, in terms of time that you have with your players.
Indeed.
I think the other thing that will save you a lot of time and headaches is, and some people will really disagree with me here probably, I think you should stick to pre-generated characters or very limited character creation options like you would find in a beginner box or a starter set where it kind of walks you through with like a little guide. Pick this, pick that, pick this. Okay.
Yeah, I generally agree. There's 2 exceptions though. I think limited pre-gen characters for you as a DM, you want to have some sense of what all the players are going to be, right?
You want to know what they're capable of.
You want to know what they're capable of and how you can serve them. You don't want to throw a party full of spellcasters, wizards, and bards, and an assassin into a front line of a war, unless they signed up for that. And they probably didn't, knowing their character choice. But also, one of the tricks you can use is you can also use your session 0, which we talked about earlier, as an easy session 0 for your first time too, to have all the players roll up with you and then help you understand what the mechanic is that they're doing while they're doing that, because they'll be looking things up in the books, you can prep and that gives you an idea to read through whatever content you have, notes, material, published adventure, to prep yourself for what they're doing, and it becomes this collaborative experience. And the other caveat is if you have a bunch of experienced players who show up, they're going to probably expect to be able to roll their own characters for whatever your first time is.
There might be some grumbling if they're forced to use pre-mades.
Like I said earlier, delegate that you can roll whatever you want, but you're restricted to, and this is the recommendation I would have, you're restricted to the core books, because that's all I want to deal with. And if I don't understand some mechanic you found in there, you're responsible for making me explain it, or I'm not going to let you do it.
Exactly. It's if you're going to have people create characters or, do more alteration to the pre-gens, do a session 0 so you're all on the same page.
Right.
Because the first time that bard uses Charm Person on your NPC and fucks up your plan, you're going to be like, uh-oh, what do I do? Why did
you make him go masturbate? He was like your core. You needed him for information. Yeah, but he was ugly, and I wanted him to just go, and I wanted to see it would be funny.
It would be funny, man. So you never know where, when there's magic in the game, you're not really always sure what's going to happen. So being kind of just aware of what the characters can do is going to make it easier. And, the other thing I like about pre-mades is, like you were saying, experienced players, like sometimes in a short game like this, they'll be bored. Not that I've ever done this. And so they'll push the boundaries with min-maxing and fiddly builds on these characters because they're like, whatever, I can make a ridiculous joke character. It's 5 sessions. Who cares? And obviously, if they're being total asshats about it, reel them in. Be like, hey, man, this is my first time. Can you just be cool and maybe not try to break the limits of the game here for me? It's cool if you want to make a really powerful character, but know how your stuff works at least so that I can trust that you're being fair to me and the rest of the players.
Don't make me have to worry about if your rules are right or not because I'm new to the game.
Exactly. The other advantage is it's so easy to kind of create the buy-in for the characters in a campaign setting. One-shots and limited series already kind of do this. Like maybe you're a company of soldiers, or, you're a hired group of adventurers and it starts that way. That's really helpful. If you're going to have people create characters and do a session 0, have their characters know each other already. That's a really good idea.
Yeah.
It will save you time. You will thank yourself later, because then you won't have to create reasons for the party to stay together and stay.
That's just good advice for DMs,
objective.
even not first-time DMs. Like,
just in general.
Yeah, it saves you so much time.
Right. And the one thing I will say that is nice about using like a pre-generated character, it's a double-edged sword, like we were saying. Like maybe someone makes something ridiculous, or they play like trash because they don't care, they're not attached to the character. That lack of attachment from having a pre-gen is going to make people more limited, more willing to do this limited run of sessions, because they know it's going to come to an end in a short amount of time. And so the fact that they couldn't make their own special snowflake character, they will be, more happy with that. Because I'm usually the player who needs their character to be a unique snowflake with special powers.
I need to own all the stuff.
Yeah, we all have our thing. We all have our player failures.
It's totally not about materialism, cheap materialism fantasies, guys. It's not, I promise.
So let's talk about running a pre-made module.
I think this is really the best bet that you can do. And I think that some of the best pre-made modules, and you can read them in advance and look at recommendations, tell you basically how to run it. This is something that I really applaud Paizo for doing, because they do it for experienced GMs and for new GMs. They understand that the chief constraint in running a game is time. That the DM has more responsibility than the other players do. So you're stepping up to do this, and the first question you're going to ask is, how am I going to find the time for all this stuff? So you start looking at ways to optimize it. How do you do more with less time? How do you do more efficiently? And so pre-made modules are a great way to do that. And a lot of them, when you read through them, are geared toward the DM that's doing that. That being said, don't jump into a big, long campaign, right? And you can buy those online. I think the best pre-made adventures that you can find are what are self-advertised as one-shot adventures. And these are often targeted at like convention games or these kinds of things, but you can find plenty of them online for free. Even because there are a lot of gamers who are like, hey, I have a bunch of buddies who are coming over tonight. We all kind of want to play D&D, or we're looking for something to do, and we don't want the night to end. It's like only 7:00. I wish I had a game prepped, and so what you may find after you encounter this a few times as a new DM, or even one as an aspiring one, is you can prep it ahead of time and just keep it prepped, like an actor memorizing a script, or even just remembering parts of the notes for that test that you knew you were going to do. And you keep it on hand, and then, like it pops out. You maybe need only 20 minutes to fresh yourself up, hand out some character sheets if you're using pre-mades, and then off you go. You're ready to go. And because it's a one-shot, it's geared at like a 3 or 4 hour time slot. So you're probably going to finish it. And if you don't get all the way there, it's easy to like wrap it up so people feel good at the end of the night, And they often will have one-shots advice in them for these are the things, they're presented because the goal of it is like, this is going to be one go.
That's like the perfect situation for a beginner box or a starter set.
Absolutely.
Because it's like, it's really, you open the box, you can pick it up and you can play it. Recently we played the Starfinder beginner box.
Super good.
And it was someone who had never DM'd before was able to sit down, run the game, went great, had a good amount of fun. Very simple.
I will say,
great.
Just as a sidebar, I think that starter boxes, I didn't have access to them when I was a kid. For a long time, they weren't published
They just weren't really like
way.
a thing that the way they are now.
After third edition, it became, digital publishing really took off and all of this. And now the starter boxes are great. I strongly recommend them.
They're pretty cool
That's
now.
a really great way to start in any RPG. The D&D starter box is a good one. The Starfinder starter box is a great one. Saying this as the person at the table who was not lucid for that game, it was easy for me, the player, to pick up my character and play and participate and have a good time despite being sick. And for my spouse, who had never run a game before but was curious and maybe wanted to step into the role very easily and do a great job.
I have to admit, she killed it, and I was like, I wish my first time DMing went like that.
Yeah,
Holy
me
shit.
too. Right.
That was great.
So big +1 for pre-made starter stuff. But I don't feel limited just to a starter box. Oh, the starter box is a great way
good place
also
to
to
start,
go.
but there's plenty of good adventures out there that can meet your needs. The nice thing though about having that pre-made module is that if something sucks, the players are probably more likely to blame the module instead of you, right? Because like the experienced players will make some Wizards of the Coast joke, and the inexperienced players are just gonna be like, "This is how this game is. I don't know
any difference."
You know, like that part's kind of nice because you can kind of disclaim a little bit of the responsibility. You're like, yeah, that NPC was really poorly written, huh, guys? What a terrible encounter.
But people don't. I mean, I think if you're willing to go out there and be like, when you put yourself out there as a DM, they're not going to shoot you down.
I mean, hopefully, if they are, you may want a different group if that's the case.
Yes. If they're like really tearing you down, why are you DMing for them in the first place?
They don't deserve you.
Go get a better teenage group.
Right. So, the other thing that I really like about kind of having a pre-made adventure is there's usually kind of a set storyline or narrative already that kind of just puts the games on rails towards a certain thing. For example, if the adventure is called like Operation Princess Rescue, you're probably going to rescue the princess, right? And so when that player's like, "Oh, well, what's over that hill over there?" It's easier to be like, "Hey, dude, like we're trying to rescue the princess. It's the whole point of the adventure. Like, just play ball with me here, man.
This is why I said earlier, like, you want to have that tagline in your head, right? What's the title of the thing, or what is it? You know, like four adventurers go rescue a princess. That's what our driving thing is for tonight.
And the nice thing is, like, an experienced player understands that a limited run adventure is more linear. It's not a fun sandbox for them to run around. If they're not being a dick, you know, they'll usually take your quest hooks and move things along.
Right.
If only because they want to get to a campaign where they can make a character. Either way, you know, as long as they're not being an asshole, you really shouldn't run into too much of a problem here.
Right.
So aside from that, you know, making sure you've chosen the right game or the right module, and you kind of have an idea of the characters and their capabilities. You know, some people, you can be good even to write up those PCs yourself and kind of learn what they can do. And that can even be a good learning experience sometimes as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that falls very much into the realm of what prep do you do for the game, before the game. I think, you know, and like what rules do you review? Because, you know, each session is going to have something that if you read through the adventure ahead of time, and you should, then you have some idea of what's involved. So, you know, have those rules on hand, have maybe a printed out quick reference sheet. Of course, read whatever it is you're going to run through. And then make notes, right? Like, I like bullet points. I do lists. I do lists and sublists and outline. And I can literally read the outline, and it has branching different parts because outlines can do that. And this is why I love that as a note-taking mechanism. And I have margins that I can take notes in for stats or hit points or everything quickly. That's my note-taking method. Other people I've played with as DMs love flowcharts. And they'll create flowcharts for the different ways the story can go, and they also can put notes in between the lines, and they can have annotations, and it's like a series, it's like their own little logic map for that. Whatever it looks like for you, it's like taking notes, you know, and it can be digital, and I like paper because I like to draw, you know. The point here, I guess, is that there's some part of this note-taking that could feel, or sometimes a little, I don't know, studious, like class notes, like I'm taking notes.
A little tedious.
Whatever it is, you know, but find the way. This should be a fun process. The prep you do before the game needs to be something that you enjoy.
It should be a kind of lonely fun. If you're dreading your prep, if you're hating your prep, and you feel like it's not helping, you may just be prepping with the wrong techniques. You may be you may be over prepping. When you first start, it's hard to know. You're probably going to spend way more time prepping than you need to. I'm one of those GMs, you know, when I would prep for 6 hours for a game, not all in one sitting, but I was just so anxious. Oh, what if this? What if that? What if this?
Then you realize, like, you're not going to get to most of that stuff.
Yeah, and you realize you never get as far as you think you're going to, except when the players decide to skip a section to a part that you haven't prepped. Of course, that will also happen as well. But the thing as a GM is remember, like, I always say you should review the rules and read the adventure. Those are two things you should do before your first session. You know, as you get better at DMing, you're probably going to review the rules less. You'll know more of the rules. You're going to review more of specific things. Like maybe there's an underwater battle coming up, so you need to know how aquatic combat works.
I like to mark them with little stickies in the books.
Right. Don't be afraid to take some notes in your book or to the side. It will help you because, you know, as a GM, it's not your job to know all of the rules. It really isn't. But you're always going to have a player or two, hopefully not too many of them, that somehow expect you to have memorized the entire Wizards of the Coast catalog.
This was the role of the DM at once upon a time, and we disabused ourselves as a community of this, and I'm glad for it. Once upon a time in the old days and the second edition days, and
In the long ago.
in the first, I think, part of third edition is where it started to change with so much else. The DM was the final arbiter, which meant, due to the wording, that the DM was expected to be able to arbitrate the details of any of the rules in any of the supplements that anybody had at the table, which the only way you could effectively do that, if you were a critically thinking DM, as most DMs are, was to understand the rules. So then you had to learn both rules. And if you had this player who wanted to use this particular spell resistance combat maneuver from this supplement they published 5 years after the core rulebooks, and this one was using a particular spell that had this key phrase about how unblockable it was, blah, 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 and they're both buried deep in their rules, you had to be able to adjudicate that, which meant that you had to know everything. And that's a mistake. That's a big mistake.
I agree. I'm huge on saying it is the player's responsibility to know how their shit works.
Yeah.
And as a DM, you shouldn't have to know how everyone at your table's abilities and spells work. You should have enough trust with your players that they're doing it fairly and not cheating. Though for your first game, the more that you know, the more it's going to help you. Because there's so many rules in this game. You can't know them all.
Yeah.
So knowing the ones that are relevant to the characters and players you have at the table will really help.
And you've played the game, so you have some sense of how the game flow is and what the things are that are relevant in a fight or stuff like that. But the most important part, I think, is to be able to make sure that it feels fair, right? You need to know enough of the rules so that each of the players feels like they're having a fair shake at this game, what it looks like. And then the rest of it is, how do you make it interesting? How do you make it fun? How do you make it...
I think something to note is, don't be afraid to use a GM screen or cheat sheets for certain rules.
I think it's a great idea to use a GM screen as the first game you're running.
They're super helpful. Just having, the actions in combat or the conditions on hand.
Have the ability to fudge dice.
Yes. If you need to for your first game, that's something you may want to do because you're not going to know how to handle it in other ways. You don't have those tools and skills yet.
Right.
I love to roll out in the open, but that was after years of using a screen and kind of figuring how it works.
Me too.
It's fudging dice is something you may need to do when you're first running, just because you don't want to derail the campaign and you don't know what else to do.
I mean, it's expedient, and
it's a very controversial thing for some players. If I knew my DM was fudging dice as a teenager, I would be like, "You fucking cheater! I'm out of here." But nowadays, I'd be like, well, I'm sure he's curating the experience to make it suck less, so I'm fine with it.
Yes, except you only do that fudging, and the only type of fudging I think really that should happen. You only do the only kind of fudging that happens when you rage quit is when they're fudging their bad guy NPC to be more badass than you.
Do not rage quit.
It feels unfair, and it feels unfair.
Don't give him more HP just because you wanted him to last longer.
But the kind of fudging that is useful, that you learn eventually, you will learn how to work around. But as your first time, you definitely want the DM screen for is how to fudge in favor of the PCs.
Yeah, it should never be harmful for the PCs when you're doing this.
I mean,
we talked about this in our DICE episode a little bit.
Right.
From the second edition. The authors even mentioned it.
Right. And one of the things is that players are inclined to zag. They're inclined to go directions that you don't anticipate, and also to get in over their heads. That's part of the fun of the game. They're going to get in over their heads. And you as the DM, one of your responsibilities is to make it so that they don't have a bad time. Everybody's there to have fun.
You're not responsible for everybody's fun.
No, they're each responsible for their own. But however, you can make sure they don't have a bad time.
Yes, you should foster an environment in which they can have fun.
Which, if they get in over their head and it turns out it was a TPK or it's looking real bad, you may really want to start fudging some dice rolls behind your DM screen.
That goblin may want to miss a little bit. So it depends. Don't be afraid in your first game. If you need to do something like that, this is the time where it's probably the most okay. Mm-hmm. People will understand. Let's talk about the rules specifically. Just kind of what are the key things you should there's an entire book of rules. What are the most important things?
I mean, I think for your first game, you need to know how initiative works. Yeah. You need to know how the basics of combat work. I don't think that you need to know... I think you need to know enough of the rules for a fight or any kind of risky, dangerous encounter, be it a fight or a trap or a rolling boulder. It doesn't have to be...
specific.
The grid... It doesn't have to be strictly theater of the mind, but it has to be one or the other. And I think you do well to be pretty skilled in both. I think that being able to use them, and have enough of a reference, like how to draw a room on a battle map, how movement works, what the actions are.
So yeah, I would say on that note, how to handle action resolution, which is really the core mechanic of 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, is rolling a dice, adding modifiers to it, and seeing if you meet a certain DC.
You need to know how the ability scores and skills affect those modifiers.
Exactly. Ability checks, saving throws, skills, like they all depend on this core mechanic. It's the core mechanic of the entire game.
Roll a d20.
And in d20, everything's really bounded to that core mechanic mathematically. So understanding that makes things, just knowing that will give you a lot of the action resolution tools that you need to run the game. And like you're saying, the other thing is know how combat works, because Dungeons and Dragons combat can be a slog, even when you know what you're doing, and it can be tricky. Combats don't always go the way you would think.
They rarely do.
And I would say if you're feeling uncomfortable with how to run a combat, set up some PCs or use pre-gen ones, look at the adventure, and run one of those encounters. Simulate it. Like, simulate it as if you were the players. What do the monsters do? What abilities do they have? It'll give you an idea of how will I run this combat for reals? It sounds kind of silly to sit there and play by yourself, but it will help you immensely. It's something me and my friends used to do for fun, just to see, like, do you think you could build a storm giant with your character? I don't know. Let's simulate it and find out.
One of these days, we're going to get our characters and we're going to take on the Tarrasque, I'm telling you.
Famous last words. The other thing I think that's really important is the magic systems. Now, I'm not saying you are going to be responsible for knowing your PC's spells and abilities. We know people are going to be looking up spells. It's always a lagging point in the game. But you need to know how the system at large functions, right? That spells have this verbal, somatic, material components, that spells usually use spell slots. That
there's a difference between arcane and divine,
exactly.
Wizards and warlocks.
You don't need to know it in depth, but you need to know it at breadth.
Yeah, and I think that also knowing what rests look like, right? Like, this is why I was talking earlier about like pacing and the flow of the game, right? You have to understand both how to keep a combat pacing alive. That's why the combat rules are useful in various situations. Maybe skills and how to use skills for challenges and pacing. And then also, magic and action resolution. How do you keep things moving? Because that's one of the other big responsibilities that you have, especially the first time when everybody's new trying to figure it out, is how to keep it moving, how to know how to resolve when a player tries to do something and move on to the next thing, because the players will drive forward. You can rely on them for that. That's the thing that you usually don't have to know how to do.
I hope so.
Yeah. Once you dangle something in front of them, it's their responsibility to grab it, and they are not going to go probably the direction that you thought, but that's okay. Now you can be reactive, and being reactive is just sort of following what's logical to you, and then talking to them about it and asking for what's logical to them.
Your own common sense and logic will get you very far in a combination with the rules. The other thing to do to prep for your first game is to really read through that module. And the way I like to do it is read through the module once. Just read it and then test yourself by seeing if you can write down a quick summary or just recounting what happens out loud to yourself, kind of like you're telling a story. And if you can do either of those things without having to refer back to it, you're doing pretty good. But regardless of how well you do, you should go through it again and make more specific notes on a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, taking notes. I mean, I look for corollary media as a reference. Like, I think screenplays are very, very relevant to
definitely
D&D games and to modules in particular, because screenplays are very reductive. They don't include any of the dressing, none of the set, none of the actors. It's just the structure of the story and the details you need in text about what that story requires. There's the set, like what's in it, and it includes the props. And that's very much what any published adventure or non-published adventure, your notes are. So being able to read through something like that, your synopsis, go whatever your favorite movie is, how do you create a synopsis? Let's say create a synopsis of Star Wars and give yourself one page of lined paper, write it down, and the structure of it as if the player characters were, I guess, who starts that out? So we're talking Luke and 3PO and R2-D2 and Obi-Wan Kenobi. And there's your party of 4. And 3PO is probably the bard, and that's probably why I hate bards, even though I went to bard college, because 3PO is the worst. And Obi-Wan Kenobi is literally the wizard. Anyway, whatever. So, and as a thought exercise, and if you're not inclined to write it down on paper, maybe then do it in the shower, while you're driving to work.
Yeah, it's a good thinking about thing.
You got to spend some thought, a little bit of brain cycles on it.
Exactly. And just thinking about the game, reading it will really help. Like, I love to take a walk and think about it in my head. I constantly just think about the game that I'm going to run and what could happen.
Yeah, I can't turn it off.
Right, exactly. I can't turn it off. That's why we're doing this podcast right now.
That's probably why you're considering running the game, because you probably can't turn it off.
Exactly. You can't. It's just in your head. So when you're making these notes, there's certain things that focusing on will really help. We've talked about them a little bit. Skylar mentioned flowcharts for this one, and this is exactly how I do it. Kind of the possible outcomes might be and what leads to those outcomes. And the nice thing about a flowchart is you don't know which way your players are going to go, but you kind of have an idea of the main big choices they can make and what that might cause. And it makes it a flowchart's an easy way to organize that information. You can do it with an outline, but just kind of knowing what the narrative anchor points are and what would lead to those outcomes, right? So that's one to really consider, because that's kind of the overlay of the whole narrative there.
Here's a cheap, useful trick. When you're taking your notes, you're going to reference a lot of stuff. Remember to write the acronym or a reference and the page number in your notes. You will thank yourself later.
You will thank yourself. I do this so much, because once you start getting other books into the mix, you're going to, or other supplements or documents, you will want to know which one that is in.
Right. And that boils down also to hey, all right, I understand that I'm going to have some NPCs, so maybe even some villains, and they have magic. This character has magic missile and that one has fireball. And make a note somewhere in your notes or in the margin or whatever, what page those spells are on, so you can find it quickly.
Because in your prep, you're like, oh, I have plenty of time to look it up. But when you're sitting there at the table and you don't have that page number and you're trying to find it and flip to it, it's going to feel like an eternity.
Right. Remember that your job is to adjudicate, right? So okay, you don't have to know necessarily, how magic missile works, but is it a D6, 3D6, or is it D4 plus 1? It's always D4 plus 1, right? Somebody asks, let's look it up real quick. And you can find it, and you can find it quick enough. But if you have that page number, you can be like, boop, there it is, you're good. And the game rolls on, and not even a blip.
That's the way to do it. Also, knowing basic information on NPCs and the related plot hooks or important magic items, just kind of knowing some details there will help you. If you have an important magic item in your little adventure, you should know how it works.
Right.
You should know who the NPCs are.
Know what it can do.
Make a couple notes there. There's plenty of ways you can do that. A lot of the time, some of these notes will be done for you if you're buying a pre-made thing. You just have to read it and make a note that helps you remember. The other thing that I think is really, really helpful for a new DM that you're going to forget is knowing the capabilities of the monsters and enemies you're going to put against the players. You will run combats with a monster and then realize, oh, I haven't used this ability or applied its effect this whole time. I totally forgot, even though it's right there on the stat block. We all have done it. It will happen. But the thing is, if you run a mock combat on your own, like we were talking about earlier, you'll probably remember to use it, and you'll have a better idea of how that monster might act. It's not something you have to do, but just knowing kind of what those monsters' options are, just like knowing what your players' options are, will give you a better idea of the possible outcomes of the encounters you're going to put forth in front of your players. And one of my other personal tips, because I'm a big map guy, if you're going to use a map, keep it handy as you read through.
Totally.
Because I can't tell you how many times if I'm reading through a dungeon, I have to flip back down to the map. I'm like, what room are they? What room is this? And you see the room and you flip back, trying to picture it in your head. Have the map handy as you read through. It'll make it so much easier for you to connect to the descriptions you're reading about to the pseudo virtual areas your players are going to be exploring.
I strongly encourage you to print it out. Even if you don't have a printer at home, go to like a FedEx office.
Yeah, that's what I do.
Or something, and print it out, because it's so useful. And not just maps. Maps are indispensable for plotting out, especially if there's like time that you have to manage. Like characters walk here at this time and they talk to this person first, and the other character, the players are like stealthing their way through, and you need to know the order of events for whatever it is you're going to do. But also for portraits of characters, to be able to show people what they look like, to have props or anchors.
An image
for the players.
To a face can be very helpful.
It really a picture saves 1,000 words.
I really
literally.
like cards for this, like little character cards that you
those
can
are
put
really
out on the
useful.
table
Yep.
so people can see the name and the character's face, because otherwise they're going to forget.
This is something that Roll20 does really well. They give you a lot of art, and you get an adventure there too, or you can find it on the internet, and you can share and show it to the PCs, force them to look here, boom, pull them this map. This is what this person looks like.
And having either pictures or just knowing the kind of the descriptions, having something in your head, like an image you've built of what you've read, will really help you rely less on reciting box text verbatim from the adventure, which your player's eyes are going to glaze over after 2 sentences.
If you're going to read the box text out loud, and you can, remember that it's also your job to make it come alive.
Yeah, you got to put some oomph into that.
Right.
I'm getting a little thirsty.
I'm thirsty too. I think I'm a little parched here. We should stop into this handy tavern right over here and have a brew.
There's always a tavern. This is great.
Yeah.
So welcome to Tavern Talk, the part of the show where we have a brew and we toast to you, our awesome listeners. Thanks for listening.
We're happy to have you. And we're going to talk about a brew that we have here today, and also a contest that we have the last week. This is the last week of the contest. If you haven't sent any of your info to us by this point, then this is your last chance.
This is your last chance. Do it now.
So what is the...
Do it now.
Get to the raffle now.
The raffle. Anyway, today...
What is the brew we have today?
Today we are drinking Stone's Arrogant Bastard Ale. I thought it was a fitting choice because you have to be a little bit of an arrogant bastard to step in there and run your first game.
The subtag for this is, you're not worthy.
Don't worry, we think you are worthy.
This is definitely not true.
We
However,
believe in you.
We understand the self-doubt.
You can do it.
You totally can be an arrogant bastard and run a game. In fact, we all need you to. The world will be a better place.
Please run more games.
So, tell me about this beer.
This is a beer that I've drinking on and off probably for the last decade. It was a little bit more fun before the big hop craze has hit craft brew. It's very aggressive. It is bitter. It is aggressive. It will be the last beer you want on your palate if you're having more than one, though.
With this beer, says this is an aggressive beer on the back.
Yeah. It says you probably won't like it. And that's, of course, to people, that's a challenge. They're like, I'll show you. Hence the name Arrogant Bastard Ale.
The thing is, you're totally spot on. This is not a new beer, and it's been around for a while, and it was lauded for a long time as one of those very hops forward.
And now it's just middle of the road with the hops.
Yeah, now it's good. It's very good still, and I think that just maybe reflects the thinking of the American beer palate in today's world. I don't know.
Yeah, we're just guys who like beer. We're not beer review professionals. But I can say this is a solid ale still. I still enjoy it. It will slow you down a little bit.
It will. It definitely will.
It will sit on your palate pretty heavy. It's about 7%.
7.2 APV. So it's stiff, but not a kick in the face. But it definitely has I would say this is what it's like a classic hoppy beer. And you drink it and you go, yeah, I don't need to rush through this. And I think maybe I need something different when I'm done.
And my favorite part is at the bottom of this beer, it says, if you don't like this beer, keep it to yourself. We don't want to hear from any sniveling yellow beer drinking wimps because this beer wasn't made for you. True to its name, the Arrogant Bastard Ale. So this is a solid one. You can't go wrong with it if you enjoy hoppy beer. Stone is usually a safe bet for most type of brews.
We hope that you're able to take your arrogant bastardness and transform it into awesome, confident scoundrelness as a good DM, because I think that maybe the arrogance gets you there, but it'll certainly turn to confidence while you're doing it.
And wisdom.
So tell me about this raffle that we have. I want to know what this last time is that we have this raffle for our lucky listeners.
Well, you're going to be shocked. It's the same as the last 7 weeks. We're giving away the core books, the foil set, not the regular books. The foil set, it comes with a little handy cozy to put them in. It comes with a really cool little DM screen. The books have the holographic foil on the cover. Now you're thinking, yeah, I already have the core books, of course. Otherwise, why am I listening to this if I don't have the core books? Well, now you can give yours to someone as a cool hand-me-down gift and you can have the cool shiny ones for yourself.
You could also be a player who just has the PHP and has decided you think you might want to try running a game, and this would be a bomb-ass
It does have
set.
the Monster Manual, DMG, and the Player's Handbook, everything you need to run your
And
games.
a nice cozy and a DM screen, and it's nice and foil, so your players would be like, all right, this DM clearly knows what he's doing. He got a nice set. I feel like he respects the game. I feel like I trust this person.
Plus, they're shiny, so...
They're beautiful.
They're shiny.
I'm jealous still. I'm still jealous of them.
So how can you win these books? Well,
So if you have to share the show. You have to share that you shared the show with somebody.
so like a hashtag on Twitter, Far Realms Radio.
Instagram.
Throw us an @ on Twitter or Instagram at Far Realms Radio.
Send us a video of you telling your friend.
Yeah, you could be, as long as you shared the show in some way, you could have texted your friend. That's fine. Take a screenshot, send it to farrealmsradio@gmail.com.
Email.
Shoot it our way. We'll make sure you get entered in it. And then we'll draw and
Put all of the entrants into a big hat. Only one per person.
Yep.
We'll pull out the winner, and then we'll let you know.
Depending on how many entrants we get, we may even just roll dice.
Ooh.
We'll see. We'll come up with something fun and creative, and we'll probably video it for you guys.
I like this idea.
Yeah. That's how we're going to do this thing.
All right, let's get back to what is involved in the actual running of the first game.
Let's do it. Back to the show.
All right, we talked a lot about the prep for the game, the decision to run a game, what it involves, getting the people, the playing, and what are some of the things that, in your opinion, is your job during the game itself? What do you as the, like in the midst of it, in the thick of it? What do you need to be able to do?
My favorite phrase for this is narrate and adjudicate. Those are the main things you're going to be doing in any game as a GM.
I like that.
Right? It also has that nice kind of little rhyme to it. Anyway, the narration is kind of the thing we all know GMs do. The exposition, the narration. Some of us are better at it than others. I'm not the greatest there. But essentially as the DM, it's important to remember you control the flow of information to the players. Without you, they have no idea what is going on in this world that their characters are standing in. It's your job to describe to them what is happening within the game. And this is a skill that you may be good at off the bat. You may struggle with it. Either way, you'll probably get better as you go through and kind of learn what things you need to truly mention and which things to avoid. Because you need to know the details of the world or the adventure in order to communicate it to the players. You need to know these details because it lets you kind of create more of a living, breathing world, right? That creates some verisimilitude or immersion, so that it comes alive, like a breathing, living place for your players.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I like narrate and adjudicate, and I would add another, which is, I'm just sitting here thinking, like, what would I call it, And I wrote down, I'm going to tell you the words I wrote down, and I don't like the words, so I'm going to tell you another word after that. I wrote down fun czar, and then the word after it I thought of was funometer.
Fun police.
I thought of fun police. I didn't write that one down on purpose. You're not the fun cop. It's not. This is why it's hard, because to figure out what to call this, because you are not. There's no enforcement in this.
You're more
role.
of offering enable.
You are an enabler. That's the point of it. Is that you as the DM, you narrate, you adjudicate, and also it's your job. Phonometer is the closest I came to, because you are the one who is uniquely empowered to be watching everybody at the table to see who is having fun and who is not.
I would use the phrase to curate.
Yeah.
Maybe curate the experience.
Curator,
there.
sure. And to be able to look at and see, like, okay, this person is really engaged in this and that person is not. So maybe I need to change the flow some. Maybe I need to interject something. Maybe I need to have some ninjas kick in the door. Whatever it is, but like that's part of it. You're the one who has you're the periscope from the submarine above water looking around. You're the DM. And so making sure that everybody is engaged in the game is part of it too.
Also make your job easier.
Yeah.
Though, when you're doing the narration, avoid too much verbatim reading of the box text like we've talked about earlier. People will tend to tune out if you're just kind of reading off that box text.
Yeah, if you're going to read it, you have to bring it to life.
And honestly, try not to read it verbatim. Read it, think about it for a second and then communicate it.
Digest
just
what it is they see.
out of your head, right? Like, or use it in your imagination. What does the room look like? And go from there.
This has changed for what it's worth from edition to edition. Like in prior editions, they wanted you to explicitly read all the box text.
There was a lot of box text.
In this edition, when you're playing at D&D, there's not very much box text, but the box text that they do have, they very much want you to read, and the quality of it isn't as good. And Paizo with Pathfinder has very good box text, and also you don't need to read it because they have other whatevers. But I guess the point is you have to bring it to life, right? The narration piece is about finding a way for the players to hook into that imaginary reality. And it's usually based on one of the five senses, So if you digest it, you can think about things like, what does it sound like? How does it feel on your skin? What does it smell like? What do you feel in your feet? And being able to answer those questions or come up with one of your own. And you only need one for any scene, like they enter a room, you can just focus on what maybe you hear a crackling of dry leaves. You smell the scent of burnt wood, like an old school dungeon RPG, like text-based. You get one little descriptor. You don't need to have one.
You only had so much room for text on the screen.
Right. You only have so much room for words at the table.
But I will say that was some advice you had given me when we were talking about scene setting before, as I was getting back into DMing again. And it has been so helpful just trying to include like two senses in a room description, because when you add in like the smell for some reason, it just makes things feel so much more real.
Right.
Because you'll notice most DMs vision and hearing, and they'll skip smell or tactile sensations or temperature and things like that. And that can really, for some people, like, it may not work on all players, but some players that will really give that connection. Like for me, I'm a big player. When people start describing smells for some reason,
yeah, that really works for you.
It really works for me, and I get uncomfortable, or I'm like, oh my God, it's so real. I don't know what it is. I'm sensitive to smells, so it's just something that works
for me. It's always auditory, right? What is the background sound? This is why I use music and sound effects in my game, because that puts me, the DM, in the world. It's what I hook into most. Is like, oh yeah, this feels like that place. Lighting can help a lot. I want to explicitly discourage you from going too far down this path. However,
don't go X-Files. Don't go candles.
Remember that this is a game.
It's not a seance.
This is a game of the imagination. It does not need a fog machine.
But hey, if that's your thing, more power to you, man. So, when you're going through narration, like, have a little fun with it. There's not too much pressure. Don't be afraid to use box text or notes or things that may help you.
Make it come alive for the players is the most important part.
Yeah, and that's going to come with time. Don't put too much pressure on yourself to do it right now. Right now, your goal should be, can I actually describe this adequately so my players know what's going on? You can get fancy and descriptive and colorful later.
Right. And they need to be able to achieve their objectives, right? Their objectives are going to be like, I want to go buy a thing. I want to go find that person and talk to him.
It'll be a process.
I want to, sell some stuff.
Yeah, it'll be a process of learning how much description is too much and how much is too little, and it'll take you a while to find that sweet spot. We've all played with that DM who gives you like a paragraph of like, he steps out the door into the morning light and wipes the sweat from his brow as he looks down the road to a carriage moving slowly towards him, and they just go on like it's a fucking novel.
I remember distinctly the very first time I had a badass NPC that had a whole paragraph text that I rehearsed and had music, and I thought my players were going to love it, and they checked out.
Yeah, they usually check out by the second or third sentence, unless you're like,
it was fast.
Yeah, it's faster than you think. So have fun with the narration. Don't go on for it too long. Your players will help you with this, by just doing crazy things. Speaking of crazy things that players do, that's the adjudication, right? That's essentially, it's you as the DM making a judgment on what happens when the players or the forces in the world take action.
Yeah, I mean, there will be resolution that needs to happen, right? The player, most times when they do something, they don't know if what they're going to do is going to succeed. Are they going to try to attack somebody? They're going to try and pick a pocket. They're going to try and convince the girl to smile at you and give you your drink for free. Whatever, but they don't know if it's going to work. And that's baked into their understanding of the game. They have powers, they have skills, they roll a die, they try to see if it works. It's your job to tell them the result, but also when they don't need to do that, right?
That's a big part of it.
Your job as the DM is to help them understand what they do need to roll for and what they don't need to roll for, and this is very much up to your feeling and sensibility of the game. So nowadays in our thinking of the game, it's not very fashionable to have the players roll for everything. once upon a time, that was a very common trope.
We're a little more fiction first these days.
Right. And that was like, once upon a time, you would run a game and the player would roll to see if they can convince the bartender to sell them a beer, when you should just be able to buy a beer. And nowadays, maybe even just like your character goes and gets a beer and we don't track the gold expenditure because who cares? Really? Are we in it for the accounting? I'm not. Are you? Are you in it for the accounting of every copper piece?
Some players are.
In your game, actually, we don't even use anything but gold, right? There's nothing but gold.
We could get started about gold, electrum, and platinum, and go on and on about coinage, but that's another argument for another day.
So, I think it's just the point of it is to keep the fun happening and to keep the flow moving,
I think
right? To being able to adjudicate for the players what makes sense that's an automatic thing they can just have.
Yeah.
So that, like, they can affect the world in this way and they don't need to roll for it. Whereas these kinds of other things, like fighting somebody, is going to require a roll.
And learning passive versus active skill use and action resolution is going to take time. It's a little tricky. It's a little bit more advanced, but you'll get it the more that you practice it. The thing to remember when you're doing rules and trying to adjudicate things is that your common sense and your rules are both just tools. They're just tools. You're not a slave to the rules. Like, your judgment overrides the rules, right? So there's going to be times where you don't need to refer to the rules, and just kind of learning how to discern when you need to refer to the rules and when you don't is going to be a big part of having a good flow to the game and building your confidence as a GM, because you shouldn't be afraid to hand wave something, especially your first time in the game, for just the sake of keeping the game going, keeping the pacing going. You can look it up afterwards. And something that I like to tell people is, like, you can just tell your players, like, look, this is how I'm going to rule on this right now because I don't want to break the pace to look it up. We can look it up later, and for future sessions we can adjust it moving forward. But for now, this is the ruling that I'm going to make.
Right. That's the heart of Rule Zero, right?
You gotta have that confidence to say that.
It's the most important part, and I think that's one of the things that the piece about having confidence to be the DM is important. Being able to say, we're going to make this call right now because this is what I understand, and that's really what it boils down to. You don't even have to say why. This is the call we're going to make right now.
Yeah,
but at the end of the day, it's enough to say, like, this is the call we're going to make right now because I understand this way, and I want to move this on, and then we'll revisit it later. And that's totally acceptable, and also something to be done. That's a skill you just need as a DM.
Yeah, you're not a slave to the rules. And the more confident you get, the more confident you'll be with either changing rules or ignoring them, or kind of learning which ones maybe suck that you need to change different for your purposes. Now, you may run into more experienced players, I'm one of these, who may have the rules kind of memorized in some ways and might push back when you suggest, hey, we're going to have it work this way. And they're going to be like, but it works this way. What the? You're invalidating my character choices. And oh, no. And there's a couple ways you can handle this. This is one that can be tough. Like, I nowadays like to just thank that player for clarifying and catching that rule for me, because I know I can't know them all. And I actually really do appreciate that. And so if some player is going to give me that clarification, I'm like, awesome, cool, thank you. We're going to use that. I really appreciate you looking that up or knowing that. Thank you.
Right. We'll go with that. Wow. All right. Didn't know it was your thing. We're going to do it that way.
But there's a way that they can do it that can be proper. And there's a way they can do it that can be a dick. And if they're being a dick, just tell them to stuff it. You're the DM right now, and say, hey, how about after, you can tell them, hey, how about after the game you teach me how that rule works, so that in the future I can make sure I'm doing it right.
I mean, this is why it comes down to, like, what people you're playing with. Right? Nobody's there, hopefully, to be a dick to each other.
Usually, if you kind of recognize that they have knowledge on this rule and say, hey, maybe after the game you could teach it to me, they'll usually be a little bit more cool with maybe dealing with it for this one session, especially because they know
a resource or something.
They know it's a limited run of sessions. They'll put up with it.
Right.
We've all put up with shitty games or campaigns for a while because we knew there was a light at the end of the tunnel.
I mean, there's an easy gotcha, I think, with players and DMs both. When there's a rule that happens it doesn't understand, it feels like somebody's cheating. It's not true. It's just,
it can feel that way.
Stupid human stuff, and I think it's the more important part is the flow of the game. Like I said earlier, you have to make sure that it feels fair. It doesn't have to actually be fair, all truth be told. It just has to feel fair for everybody. They go like, okay, I feel like I got a fair shake, and we can talk about it later, and that's part of the core of this game, is that it's a social game. So, you have to be able to do that stuff.
I know a lot of us may struggle with the social parts of the game. For me, there's certain sticking points there, and different people are dealing with different things. So you got to meet them with where they're at. If you have a player who deals with something like anxiety, maybe not throw the spotlight on them all the time. If it's tough for them. That's something that when you're first DMing, it's going to kind of be hard. you're going to be so stuck on trying to just wrap your head around the whirlwind of activity of running the game that you won't have time to read your players. Is something you maybe you do. If so, that's awesome.
I mean, if you do, then you're probably not paying attention to the rules.
Probably not if it's your first game. But that's something I noticed. It took me a while, even with jumping back into 5e, before I could spend time reading my players rather than like flipping frantically through a book, being prepared for whatever was going to happen next. So, don't be hesitant to adjudicate the way that you need to keep the flow, to keep the pace of the game. And kind of talking about that pace of the game, that loop, every game kind of has a gameplay loop, right? Pokemon, you train your Pokemon, you catch new ones, you heal them, you get gym badges, rinse and repeat, right? Most RPGs especially have some kind of gameplay loop.
I mean, even Mario, right? You start a level, you run through the level, you try to get the end at a certain time.
Monster Hunter has an amazing gameplay loop, which always gets me. I love it.
Magic the Gathering has turns.
Right? So there's always going to be something there. But I think no matter what, however you're looking at this loop in Dungeons & Dragons, create a strong start for whatever your session may be. This is one that I learned from Mike Shea's Lazy Dungeon Master's Guide, which is a fantastic resource for new DMs. It's one of the few out there that will probably actually help you prep for the game.
Big plus one.
I would highly recommend you check it out. Lazy Dungeon Master, Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master.
Also very good. Also very
fantastic. It has some really good resources that can help you feel less anxious about your prep. It really helped me the first time I read it. It's great stuff. Mike Shea does awesome material. So you can't go wrong there. You may see it listed under a Sly Flourish as well. So check that out if you're feeling a little anxious about where to start.
Lazy Dungeon Master's Guide is big plus.
But yeah, one of my favorite tips from Mike is that you should create a strong start. I think personally the easiest way to do this is kind of starting in media res. And
you took the words right out of my mind.
Right? Yeah. And when in doubt, start with combat. Like, it sounds silly, but it really works.
I actually think combat is way better than even a chase.
No, when you start combat, people zone in because there's suddenly risk, right? Like, they could die, something could go wrong. They'll stand up sometimes and really pay attention and look at that board more than if, you're starting in a fucking tavern.
Right. I mean, it's an old trope. But I think part of why like a fight is really good as opposed to a chase is because chase rules are often very hard to adjudicate in any game. And it requires, a lot of weird event-based. It's just they're
also,
not.
A chase has to have the possibility of complete failure for it to feel like a chase.
Right. A fight is a very clear in media res. In media res is really the way I think that's the best. Like, what's in the middle? What's the most important thing that's happening right now? Answer this question for yourself, and also see if the players can answer it right now. Right now, it's a life or death choice. Why?
And the nice thing is, like, most modules and one-shots that you're going to be running for this
they'll start you there.
They'll start you there, or very close to it, to the point where you can, like, maybe they start, down the road, but you can flip to combat in the first 5 minutes and really kind of get everyone dialed in.
If they're like, yeah, you roll into a town, the players should be arriving on a wagon, blah, 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 have the wagon be attacked. Remember, you're the DM. You're in charge.
You can always have orcs attack the party.
It's up to you.
No one's going to question orcs attacking the party most of the time. There's very few contexts in D&D where they're like, oh my god, this is so unrealistic that orcs would attack us here.
Also, very seldom is any player going to be like, yeah, I really am not looking forward to showing off my powers, killing a bunch of mooks.
It is a game about killing monsters and taking their things. Yes. So that's not a bad thing to use. The game is designed to do that well. The other thing I would say is, honestly, this is me personally, avoid the starting in a tavern, characters meeting each other bullshit. You're running a limited setting session adventure. It should take care of some of this already by providing a background why your characters might know each other or giving you a starting scene. You're only playing a couple sessions. Don't waste it on your characters doing this awkward introduction kind of stuff. Start out, assume the party either knows each other, or you can do something that you'll see in Fate and other systems where each PC knows
shared
at least
background.
Yeah, they know at least one other PC from their past.
Yeah, this one's tough actually for a 5th edition. I think it's in a lot of the adventures that they publish, the official ones. They're not as really explicit on how to start the players in the same place, how to start them knowing each other, how to have a bond. I think that this is a thing that you can totally push off to the players and should, especially for your first session. Put it on the players as their responsibility. You all have to figure out, as a group, this is your first challenge. You have to figure out how you all know each other and make it good. And don't, get caught up in arguing while you do it. And then whatever they come up with, give them 10 experience. Yeah. Congratulations, you have the experience of all starting together. and you guys now all know each other, and they solved that for you. And
you can always bribe them with experience or gold.
And while they're arguing about and creating and talking and all of the things that they have as shared background and where they come from,
Take notes.
Take notes. This gives you an easy hook. It gives you automatic, easy stuff to just riff off of.
They're doing your work for you.
Yes.
So take notes when they start to come up with that kind of stuff. It will really help. It's not the DM's job to give you a reason to be in a party of adventurers. That's literally the player's job, is to create an adventurer. It's not the DM's job, especially not in their first session. That's ridiculous.
Right.
So moving on from that, let's kind of look at the loop itself, because it's surprisingly simple, actually. You're going to, one, describe what is happening. You will then certainly ask the players, what do you do? You're going to say this phrase a lot. If you're not saying this phrase in some form a lot, you might be doing something wrong.
Right. I mean, the game is basically you make a description, they hear it, they do something,
and then
you probably prompt them, what do you do? That's how they know that their turn to act.
And then you're going to adjudicate their actions, through dealing with the rules or however
you respond to what they say.
You need to resolve those actions. You're going to describe the consequences of those actions, and then guess what? You're going to ask them what they do again.
Right.
And the cycle will continue like that, and then the game will be over eventually.
Yeah, I mean, and it's overly simplistic sounding, but it's surprising how far that carries you. And also, when you ask the question, what do? You describe the room, you describe who's in the room, you describe what's going on and all the scene, what they hear, and you've been talking for 30 seconds, and finally, when you've done describing all of the sounds and the smells and the da-da-da, what do you do? And there's this pause, and your players, and it's your first time, and your players are not saying anything, and they're just sort of waiting. Don't feel compelled to fill the space. Let that space just sit. And you say, what do you do? And
don't be afraid to repeat it.
Sits there and you go, what do you do? After a minute, they'll figure it out. They have to figure out some group dynamics for themselves too, right? Yeah. So part of the responsibility of the DM, you frame the situation, you toss it to them as part of this loop, and then they have to figure out how they're going to resolve it. And
exactly.
if you find that this is a group that you're playing with regularly, they will fall into patterns. They'll create norms.
You'll usually have a player or two who will take action more readily than others.
They'll figure it out. But for your first game, when you ask this, remember, it's new for everybody. And even if you have experienced players at the table, it's new for them having you as their DM. So they don't yet know. They're riffing off of you too,
Yeah, that's a good point. Is they're adjusting to a new DM as well, so they might play a little differently, or
the way to see, kind
of see what can I do, what can I get away with.
Even if it's the same players, the player dynamic is different, right? Like Billy, when he runs the game, well, okay, we all know how he responds. When Billy says, "What do you do?" Jim is always first to say whatever, but now Sally is running the game, and Jim is playing a different character. Billy's also a character. Is Billy going to be the first?
I'm very different as a player than I am as a DM.
Me too.
It's funny because I wouldn't have expected it, but the more that I play both roles and I examine them, I laugh to myself because I don't think I'm a player that I would want in my own game.
I wondered this myself, I think that I probably... Oh man, that's
I get upset when people are doing unoptimal things. I have to hold my tongue a lot. It's tough. It's tough being a PC.
We're gonna have to talk about that next, I think, because that's a whole can of worms I haven't actually thought very much about. Like, would I want to be a player in my own game? And part of that is because I spent a lot of time running the game as opposed to playing characters. But I do think back about the differences. It really is a different game that you're playing as the DM.
It's a totally different experience.
And it's part of the beauty of the game is that you can play these two compatible, separate, interrelated games at a table together.
Yeah, I love it.
Also, I guess just the last thing about this is that about other things to do to pay attention to while you're running the game. In many games in this space today, there is a movement for what they call GM-less games, where this big risky task that you've stepped up and decided to do to run a game, the game is structured, these other games are structured such that this role doesn't exist. It's a shared process.
Or some of the responsibilities are disclaimed from that role,
right.
And maybe it exists in a lesser form.
They're farmed out to the other players or delegated over here or whatever it looks like. And I say this specifically because it's all a game. This is why I harped on fun earlier. So we should all be having fun. And we're making it all up. It's make-believe game. So in this loop of, even in those games, where one person has the camera or the scene or the spotlight at any given moment, it's the same sort of loop, right? Describing what goes on and then waiting for other player interaction. Know, too, that as the DM in D&D, which is very traditional in this regard, you have the power to change the dynamic of what that looks like. You're the one who gets to say who can say stuff, and you can empower players to run stuff too. So another trick that I've often done with people I don't know, or how the game is, new people at the table, is if I'm the DM, I'll say, you walk into a tavern, and Joe, why don't you tell us what's in the tavern? Especially for an experienced player at your table.
Exactly. And for some new players, it can like freak them out a little bit. But being able to disclaim some narrative responsibility or an NPC or description to certain players can, one, make your job a lot easier as a new player. Like if you have a really experienced player that you can trust, maybe they can run that NPC in combat for you and not do something stupid. Maybe they can run initiative for you. Don't be afraid to throw like Skylar just said, what does this room look like? What do you notice the most? And, doing that within certain like safe boundaries can be really helpful and take a little bit of the pressure off of you. Though it can also be a slippery slope depending on who you're giving agency to and how much.
Right. I would say, you're probably going to have some experienced player at your table if you're running it for the first time, because you would have to have encountered it with somebody. But know your table. Always know your table. Know who would be interested in that. Ask for permission. Don't just toss it on them, because they'll be like, no.
remember, the thing to remember here is that RPGs are really a conversation, right? It's a game, but at its heart, it's really a conversation between players in the GM. And the thing to understand is different games lie in different parts on that spectrum. When we look at Dungeons and Dragons, it's almost more like you are leading a class of people, right? Like you're in a more kind of a slightly more authoritative position. Whereas if we look at things like Dungeon World, it's similar, but there's a little bit more player agency. And if we keep sliding down to things like Blades in the Dark or completely GM-less systems, we see it truly become more of a back and forth conversation where the players in the group as a whole have more the same or just as much agency as the DM might in certain situations, which is it's really interesting is to remember that, different games are going to be at a different place on that spectrum of conversation. Some games may be more one-sided than others, and that's okay. You'll find certain, aspects of that you like and you don't like.
In classic BattleTech, the conversation is done at the end of a muzzle of an autocannon and a laser. That's where the conversation is. As I blow off your right arm, you DM, GM, enemy, whatever.
But yeah, when we're talking about conversations too, the ones that can be tricky to navigate as a new DM are the conversations following the game. Because you just went from being a player who maybe walks out with the other players and you chat in the parking lot before you go home about the story, right? Remember, the narrative is what happens in the game. The story is what we tell each other later. The narrative and the story are different aspects. And all of a sudden, now you're the GM. You're not going to get the same maybe honest feedback or criticisms you used to hear from player to player. It's just, that may not be the case. And it could be a better thing for you sometimes. Maybe you're not ready to hear that as a new GM, because not all players are GMs. It's really important to understand that. It doesn't, and that means a lot of them are not going to be capable of offering constructive criticism because they can't see things from your side of the table, from your perspective. Right? They just, if they haven't GM before, they really don't understand what you're going through. They may know like, oh, that NPC sucked, or I hated that combat, but they don't know, they're not going to understand why that happened.
Yeah, I mean, like, and not every player is the right person for every game either, or DM. And that's even for each edition of a game, So there's, for instance, one player that we both know that I've played with that will play in most any kind of game, but when running a game only uses 4th edition, which, that's just what that person is comfortable with. So it's like, the kind of feedback they're going to give you about a game is very different than the kind of feedback you might be normally expecting. It depends, So, like, you have to understand that, like, everybody who shows at your table has their own biases too, right? And they're all gonna, and that's based on other games they've played. Is it like a video game that I know? Is it like an escape room game? Depending on what their preconceived notion of the game is before they arrive, right? So I guess having that conversation about feedback, it really depends. This is, again, know your table. I have always found it to be better one-on-one. Like, the people, you talked to them, you got them involved in the game probably, you may have invited them, and so, like, you're probably talking to these people regularly, and hopefully talking about the game regularly.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice if you have another experienced GM in the group who can maybe give you a helpful tip or two, but here's the thing, when you're GMing for these first couple sessions, it's going to be a whirlwind of activity. Even though the game might feel like it's going slow sometimes, it may not feel like that on your side of the screen. And you may actually just struggle to implement their advice or remember it in the moment because you're juggling so many plates. So it can be tricky asking for this feedback. And like you said, in a group situation, people are probably not going to be truly honest and give you what's useful feedback. And sometimes, that might be too honest and crush your confidence a little bit. It can definitely happen because it's your first game. Parts of it probably sucked, and as an experienced player, I may have had fun and enjoyed it. But if you want me to get truly objective and critical, I can. I can tell you the things I hate about everything that I love. That's just how I am. That's like, I made a profession out of this. Like, I can love something to pieces and tell you what sucks about it.
I think
I'm just that way.
The core of it is that you want to run, hopefully, the next game, and you want the players to come back for another game.
Yeah, if they show up for your next game, that's probably the best feedback you're going to get.
Right.
You didn't screw the pooch. Right. Like, they're back. You can keep running. I will say one cool tip I've seen from other DMs is they'll wait a day or two, and they will send out an anonymous survey to their players to try and just kind of get, the anonymity. Like, if you know your players, you'll kind of know who wrote what. But that can, just knowing that there's that can help them.
It's a very safe way to do it.
It's a safe way to do it if you're.
Did you like the combat or not?
If you're ready for that criticism, right?
Did you like a character or not?
Here's the thing: as a new DM, I don't think this criticism is very helpful. This feedback's not useful because you're just trying to get your shit together. Like, maybe it's just a simple mistake that you made, and you're actually really good at that thing that they think you're bad at. You just prepped wrong. So I say
that happens sometimes.
Like, don't worry about the feedback, honestly, till you get to the end of this thing. Finish all 3 or 5 sessions. Talk to your players. Be like, okay, now that we got through that, do you guys want to run a campaign like this? And start pitching them some ideas.
Yeah, I think that at the end of a module is the best way to do that. At the end of the adventure, right?
So how did this go? What
did
we
you like
think?
it? Were there villains that you didn't like that you did? Did you feel challenged? Did you not feel challenged? But yes, definitely. And I think that the best way to get feedback really is to keep running the game. Keep running the game.
Keep running it.
And then, you may sometimes have a player who's like, yeah, I'm not out. I'm not in this time. Yeah. And you're like, well, next time you say, so you stopped coming. Like, why did you stop coming? Yeah, well, there wasn't enough fighting for me, or there was too much fighting for me, or I just got busy and I can't set aside 4 hours,
And that's the thing. You can't take it personally. Like, if you're running a wacky, like maybe you're running a super wacky pirate game, and they're just your players like these. Like, this is not my jam. Like,
or you threw them into the Underdark, where the world is kind of grim.
Yeah, and that's fine. Try not to take it personally. It's really important to understand that as working adults, we all have very limited time to play games. Like, if you actually map out how much time you have to play games for the rest of your life, you will be sad. So don't do that. It's so much more limited than you think. It really is. So it's a big thing that I think you should spend the time playing games you really enjoy. And if it's a group of people that you can trust, like, they will understand if you say, hey, like, the game you ran was great. I'm really not into 4E, it's just not my jam. Mm-hmm. I don't feel like...
Or Warhammer Fantasy in my case.
I'm just not into it, and I only have these 4 hours to game each week.
Right.
So I'm going to try something else. But, if you end up switching, like, keep me in the loop. I would love to come back. So don't take it too personally. If someone...
You get a lot of clout from putting yourself out there to be a DM in the first place. Anybody to run a game.
Any cool player will respect you for putting yourself out there and trying to run a game.
Absolutely.
Anyone who's DM'd before knows what it's like being behind the screen.
Absolutely.
And how crazy it can feel, even though the game's moving at a snail's pace. So when you finish that limited run of sessions, that's where you're going to get the most useful feedback, and it's going to come from yourself. It's not going to come from an external source. It's going to be, did you enjoy this GMing thing? Do you want to do more of it? Maybe you need to do more of it. That's myself. How did it go, right? So, and if the bugs bit you, you'll know, because you won't be able to turn it off. It will be there in your brain. constantly.
You'll find times in the moments when you're waiting on mass transit or washing your hair.
Or when you should be working at work.
When you are definitely, quote, working at work,
And
definitely typing loudly, totally not researching different character options for my players.
Of course not.
Totally not researching different villains that will kill them. Totally not researching ways that I can map out their inevitable demise.
Important business stuff.
I'm clearly earning
yes.
my living.
So hopefully you got something useful from our blathering over the...
And hopefully one day there's an opportunity that you have to come and run a game for us. I think that would be a delightful, maybe at a convention or Comic-Con or something. Who knows? We'll see. But if we at all inspired you to take up this game and give it a shot and it sticks, then...
Our job is done.
Our job is done.
If we got one person...
And I would be delighted at some point
games
down the road for you to run a game somewhere, somehow. Don't you stalk me, though. I'm not into that.
Honestly, if we get one or two people to run games from this podcast, we've done our job.
Absolutely.
It's worth it. So go out there, run games. You're great. You can do it.
Until next time.
Over and out.